Good evening. I'm Bob Schwartz of the Gay Liberation Network, and welcome to our monthly program. Tonight I have the honor to introduce the guest sitting next to me, who is Roy Wesley. And as you've hopefully noted in the run-up to the program, we're going to be talking about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. This year is the 75th anniversary of that event. And I think it's important to point out that the current hysteria regarding Muslims, talk of a ban, talk of new walls being built between the United States and Mexico. This may seem like something entirely new to people, but it certainly is not. It's really a part of the history of the United States, beginning arguably with the genocide against the Native Americans, which we could talk about later if it comes up. But there's been a whole series of crimes against humanity, if you will, that's been committed by the United States government. So tonight we do want to focus on the incarceration of the Japanese Americans during World War II. This involves some 110, 120,000
yes, about that.
People. So Roy is currently the Chief Operating Officer of his own biotech company. He worked on the curatorial committee for the Applewood exhibit, Then They Came for Me, which we will talk about and show images from at some length tonight. So welcome, Roy.
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's begin then with the images from the gallery. There's the lead in to the show, if you will, at the Applewood Gallery at 2401 North Halsted Street. Then They Came for Me, incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II and the demise of civil liberties. Then They Came for Me, that's part of a quote from the German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. They came for everybody else, and then finally they came for me.
Right.
That's right.
And then there was no one left to defend him.
That's right.
He didn't defend the other people who were attacked, the socialists, the labor leaders, the communists, the Jews, and then they came for him, and there was no one left to defend him. So let's proceed with these images. Well, I should mention that the exhibit is open at 2401 North Halsted Street Wednesday and Thursdays 11 a.m. to 8 p.m., Fridays through Sundays 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. There, we got that in. Roy, could you comment about these images?
These were the posters that were put up all over the West Coast and the cities, informing the Japanese Americans that they had to be evacuated from their location to a place that they actually never knew where they were going to go. Some people felt they were actually going to be shot because they didn't know what was going to happen to them. And these notices were put up very quickly within hours after the Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Roosevelt on February 19th of 1941.
Well, just let me emphasize, in case there may be some people out there who didn't hear that, this was signed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, not Donald Trump, but the liberal icon, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, at a time when the government was actually denying its own reports that the Japanese were loyal
Right. Japanese Americans were extremely loyal. There was no evidence of any problems or issues of security at that time, and throughout the war period, none were found. So it was a scare tactic. It was unjustified, and it was in fact unconstitutional, as was verified by the Supreme Court later.
Yeah.
So here we have the armed guard soldiers guarding the camps, and makeshift tents. I think those were actually the tents behind were for the soldiers themselves. The prisoners, such as myself, were put into barbed wired camps at that time. And here we have the stores that were closed, and all of this happened in a matter of days and weeks. People had to dispose of their properties. Their civil liberties were taken away. They couldn't own properties. They could not continue to work. They couldn't hold bank accounts. Everything had to be divested before they left for the camps. And here's another sign. That this is from the book Un-American that shows that they would have to leave very quickly. An image of a father with his son, or perhaps a grandfather and the grandchild, waiting for being taken away to the camp. And the tag that the man is wearing, everybody had a number that identified them, and if you didn't have your tag, it was almost like not having your identity papers. It was absolutely required. And here we have the soldiers watching and guarding the people being rounded up and sent off, looks like onto the train at that point. And here's a family with their luggage, and you were allowed one piece of luggage per person to take with you well, people never knew how long they were going to be gone, and in most cases it was for a period of 2 to 4 years. And another image of people being sent off rather quickly. Looks like there's a soldier there. And just a mother watching over her children, waiting. And they're actually in one of the barrack rooms, barrack buildings in one of the camps with the tar paper walls on the side.
Well, and you were actually born on the day, May 5th, 1942, on the day when your family had been ordered to leave for one of the camps.
That's right. I was actually born that day, and my mom was, well, the order said that you had to go in by 12 noon of that day or suffer the penalty, and the penalty, of course, was you would be put into prison. But we were going to prison anyway, so really probably didn't make any difference. But the fact was that they gave us 3 days to recover. My mom had 3 days to recover, and then we were transported to the Portland Assembly Center, which was a converted exposition center where the livestock were held in these pens and stalls. And they quickly put up these barriers with 10 by 10 rooms made out of plywood, covered the manure on the floor with plywood so that you wouldn't be standing in the manure, but it didn't help the smell or all the flies that came up, during the spring and into the summer. There were thousands and thousands of flies. So of course the solution was they issued us ply paper that they hanged from the ceiling, where you had one light bulb in each room plus all these fly paper things to catch the flies. So sanitation was a real problem. And there were only 2 areas where the toilets were. One on the far side of the exposition center, and the other for the women, and for the men it was on the opposite side. I'm not sure where we were at that time, but my mom had to bathe me somehow, and it was too dangerous to put babies into the showers, so she had to bathe me in the laundry room, in the wash tubs every day, several times a day probably, because especially when it was hot, no air conditioning. None of the luxuries or amenities that we used to have at home. And even washing diapers. I mean, probably go through all of, and those days we did not have disposable diapers, so she ended up washing diapers every day, several times a day, and then hanging them up to dry. And hopefully the weather was good because everything was outdoors. So if it rained, had wet diapers.
Let's move on to some of your family pictures.
This is a picture of my grandparents on my father's side. The Wessigys is our family name, and that's my grandfather on the left and my grandmother Wessigi on the right, and that's my dad in the middle. And this is taken about 1917 when he was born. And this is the other side of my family, the Sasakis. My Grandpa Sasaki, they were both here because they wanted to study music. He was originally supposed to be a priest, but he rebelled and left the temple so that he could come to America to study music. And that's my mom that my grandma is holding in her lap, her older brother and their sister, Bessie. So they try to be as American as possible, and as you can tell in both of those pictures, they're wearing Western clothes. And that's part of the identity of the Japanese Americans. They really worked very hard to be totally Americanized and to integrate into the society that they were living in. This is a copy of the exclusion order that had us go to, in this one that says it's in Portland, and that address happened to be the Salvation Army, which was the pickup site where we were going to be taken to the Portland Assembly Center.
Now these orders, I understand, were issued pursuant to the directive of Roosevelt.
That's right, the Executive Order 9066.
The executive order issued by President Roosevelt.
And that was February 19th. In response to that, my parents, in that year, it was a very bleak Christmas after Pearl Harbor and that executive order and knowing that they would be leaving. In that Christmas before, the next slide shows the Christmas card that they sent out to show that they really were supportive, that they were true Americans. After all, my mom and dad were born in America, so by all rights they were citizens. And it should be noted that of the 120,000 Japanese Americans, 75% were citizens of the United States. The other 25% were the immigrant families like my grandparents who were denied citizenship by law, by the Asian exclusion laws that existed at that time period. So they were not entitled to become citizens until 1956 when that was reversed. This is an aerial view of the Portland Assembly Center where we were, and as you can see, there were 4,000 people put into these quickly built sheds over the animal stalls. And as I said, the women's toilets, and which were horrible situations, just holes in a plank with no privacy whatsoever. The women's were on the left and the men's were on the right, so it was quite a distance to go no matter where you were to even get to the bathroom. And this is just a layout showing some of the different things and the fact that we had just one mess hall where everybody had to eat and on a scheduled basis, which disrupted the family life. People couldn't eat together as families. You had men eating with the men, women with women, children eating together. And so the normal family life was totally broken down under this kind of a situation. This is a picture of me. I'm on the left as a baby. This is actually taken in Minidoka, Idaho, which was the concentration camp there where we were sent after the Portland Assembly Center. We were in the Assembly Center for 5 months and then shipped by train with the shades drawn because they didn't want people in the towns to see who they were transporting, and they didn't want us to see where we were going. And that's a picture of my mom with my brother, or my older brother on the right. This is something that was characteristic of the time period because the anti-discrimination, the discrimination against the Japanese was so strong that they issued hunting licenses at that time, and there were all kinds of forms of this. There were certificates, there were these badges, there were placards, and you know, this is not just an isolated thing for that time because we have seen the same kind of thing with a Muslim hunting license showing up in this past year. And that kind of hysteria is beginning to build here just as much as it did 75 years ago. And this is another expression of that kind of hostility. It's a portrayal of the yellow peril killing off the poor white woman there. It represents European and Western civilization.
When I heard you speak earlier, several weeks ago, Roy, you mentioned that, and you just alluded to one example of it with the current hostility being stirred up against Muslims. But you mentioned that what happened to the Japanese should not be seen as an aberration. It should not be seen as an isolated incident, as somehow an exception to what usually went on in the United States. I mean, I mentioned the genocide of the indigenous peoples. There are other examples
Oh,
too.
absolutely. Unfortunately, we have too many examples of our country not doing the proper thing, preserving people's civil rights and liberties. Freedom is really a very precious thing, and when civil rights are taken away from people, something has to be done. People have to speak up and express themselves to protect other people's rights. Just the other day, last week, there were stories in the New York Times about nooses being found along the National Mall. They were found even at the Hirshhorn Museum, which is anti-Jewish. They were found all over the country. In fact, they're popping up everywhere, and it's an expression of the alt-right, the white supremacist movement, which is trying to take away the liberties of minorities in the country. And if that continues to grow, it looks like a very fascist period for the United States.
Well, that's certainly a danger. One thing that impressed me at the gallery was the inclusion of the Black Lives Matter movement as an example of something that people who are concerned for the rights not only of Japanese Americans but and Muslims, but they should also embrace the rights of African Americans. And we see that white supremacy is still an underlying problem in the United States with all of these cop killings of black men. Most of them done with impunity because they know there are no consequences.
Right. And the Department of Justice is moving in the wrong direction with regard to that.
Yes.
We're heading into a lawless society that's protecting, unfortunately, the wrong people who really should be being prosecuted.
Right. Well, and I also learned at the exhibit at the Alfrewood Gallery that when Fred Korematsu, am I saying that right?
Korematsu, yes.
Yeah. Who challenged, to his credit, he challenged the incarceration of the Japanese Americans. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled, I think it was 6-3, against Korematsu, which shows that you can't depend on the courts to always do the right thing, but the United States government lied when presenting evidence to the court in support of upholding the incarceration. They told lies about alleged incidents of Japanese disloyalty. Yeah.
Well, attacks and disloyalty, and those were and they were proven to be false. But nonetheless, it swayed the opinion both of the public and of the courts. And it's interesting to note that even today, that decision to incarcerate in case of war still stands. We can still do that today. It's never been removed.
Well, that's a scary thing, and it doesn't come as any surprise to me that there was government lying in those days.
and it continues.
Their government lies today. You know, we all remember the lies that were told to get the United States to attack the Iraqi regime with the alleged weapons of mass destruction. You made a speech at the Alphawood Gallery at the time that it was
The opening.
that the exhibit was opened. Could you say a little bit about what you said on that occasion?
I was trying to point out the history of Japanese immigration, first to the United States, and why they came. You know, like every immigrant population, they were seeking a better life, a place to raise their family without all the problems that they were leaving behind. And, you know, they fought the culture and the times because things were denied them, just the basic kinds of things and the rights, because they weren't allowed to become citizens. They had to work for very low wages, doing jobs that nobody else would take. And we can think of every other immigrant group that's come to America have been in the same situation when you look at the Irish, the Polish, the Swedish, the Mexicans, any group that you name have gone through the same experience. And yet they have built a foundation of strength and helped create our country to be what it is today. I mean, where would we be today without the services of our immigrant labor? We can't just simply deport them all. I think that's nonsense. Well, the Japanese were in the same boat, you know, 75 to 100 years ago when they were immigrating. And so they worked very hard, and what I tried to show was the typical story that my grandparents all went through, and yet when Pearl Harbor hit and all that discrimination was blown up, they had to be sent to the camps and excluded from being full participatory citizens in the country with their children who were the citizens, and all their rights were denied. So for those 4 years or so, the population had to live under those horrible conditions. And you know, it's that we have to remember not to allow to happen again to immigrant populations, just because they happen to be able to be identified as such and can be rounded up.
One thing that I noticed at the gallery that I wanted to ask you about, and I had known that that there were people who were incarcerated who were drafted into the United States military, people who were taken away from their homes, denied their rights, imprisoned, were drafted into the United States military. But there were a few who said, we're not going to do it. These were the no-no boys.
No-no boys.
The
right.
no-no boys. And I have to think that it took a lot of courage for those men to do that.
Absolutely. There were two questions, questioning loyalty and obedience to the emperor. And, you know, a lot of the soldiers felt, well, they were American citizens. They never had anything to do with the Emperor of Japan.
Of course.
So how could they say that they were, you know, they would forswear it? They could never forswear it because they never had any allegiance to begin with. So that was a no. And the second no was, you know, was an insult to their citizenship. Some of the men felt that that the country should restore the rights for their families first, and then they would go serve. Many volunteered in spite of that.
Yes. Well, I was at the Manzanar concentration camp 2 years ago, and I became aware there that there were protests in the camps.
Yes.
And there were casualties. Some of the inmates were shot down by United States troops who were guarding them at that and the other. I think that there were 10 camps altogether.
Yes.
So I mean, this was it was a very serious event, and as Roy has said, this is something that we must not allow to be repeated.
Mhm.
Okay, we're going to talk again briefly about the exhibit at the Applewood Gallery, 2401 North Halsted. That's right at the intersection of Fullerton. Then They Came for Me. You can see that Wednesdays and Thursdays from 11 a.m. to 8 p.m., Fridays through Sundays, 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. So with that, I'd like to thank our guest, Roy Wesley. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.